Hi again then guys, and welcome to another installment of Beards and Cars. And for those who are maybe unfamiliar with this series, this is a podcast style layout where we get into various topics in a slightly more informal manner than say a breakdown or a tune, but it could relate to pretty much anything. Could be movies, games, the channel, YouTube, whatever. But lately, over the past, say, 4 or 5 weeks in particular, we've been amalgamating it into more of a countdown style layout. And of course, I've featured circuits that I think should come back to the franchise, circuits which should debut in the Gran Turismo franchise, and last week, of course, 10 cars, plus a couple of honourable mentions, which I would love to see return to the franchise. So once again, cars that were featured in previous Gran Turismo games, but are not currently. And of course, these lists are very personal. That's why I always say slap your personal selections down below, because each person wants different vehicles and different tracks to either come back or to make their debut in the game. And of course, this week is the much broader and much more difficult countdown to do, especially when you're talking about only 10 cars, plus 2 honourable mentions. This is 10 cars which I think, or I would love to see arrive in the Gran Turismo franchise for the very first time. Now, most of these cars have in some form or another, be it Forza or Drive Club or a rally game for instance, have been featured in other games. There are, however, a couple of cars in my countdown which have not, as far as I'm aware, been featured in any games as standard. I think one of them has been featured as a community-created mod, but it's not in the game as standard. And those two in particular are probably the ones which, funnily enough, I think have the lowest chance of actually coming to the game, but we'll get to those in due time. Now, as I pointed out at the start of the video on screen, if you'd like to skip around to different vehicles on the list, maybe for future reference or watch it out of order, then you can check all of those time codes in the video down in the description. But for now, first of all, I'm going to kick off with a car which anyone who's followed the channel recently, especially with my top 50 favourite car countdown, will know that I have a lot of love for it. The Maserati MC12. It's a strong car in the Forza franchise. It's not featured in every game, but it is featured in most of them, and every game that features the MC12 treats it with a lot of respect. It's not necessarily the best supercar on offer. It's in Forza, as I said, it's in Test Drive Unlimited, Project Gotham, a couple of others too. But it's one of those cars which manages to not just be a unicorn, because it is, it's super rare, super exclusive, very desirable car, but it's also one of those cars like a Gumper Apollo or an Ascari A10 or a Mosler, where it goes beyond just being pretty or on paper sounds good, and it actually is competitive. Because although, of course, it is based on the Enzo, which is in the Gran Turismo franchise already, and has been for a couple of games, hugely popular car, very competitive as well, the MC12 takes a different approach to the Enzo. And again, I've talked about this before, so I'll keep it brief. But of course, the MC12 is longer than the Enzo. It has more downforce in play, more fixed downforce in particular. Instead of the active wing, it has that large GT1 style rear wing. For good reason, it's a GT1 car for the street, and it takes much more of a 90s Le Mans car approach to its styling, and it benefits from that, because even with far less power than the Enzo, it's still faster around the Nordschleife. So, the reality speaks for itself. It was a very competitive race car as well, plus look at it, it's a rolling piece of art, as I always say. Of course, I'd love to see the MC12 feature. Maserati has been in the franchise before, but we've only had the Gran Turismo in Gran Turismo, no surprises there. I mean, come on, Polyphony, the MC12, why wouldn't you want it in the game? It would make a perfect rival for the Enzo, and we do already, after all, have that one. Next up on the list, I'm putting my straight-up dream car. This is a car which the majority of the community probably would give a take and not miss it too much, but for obvious reasons, being my dream car, of course I want it in the game. The Ferrari FF is completely different to anything else they've made. They have made shooting brakes before, as customs, like the 456 shooting brake, but nothing like this. An all-wheel drive, 7-speed, 2+2 shooting brake. It's everything I love in a car. Brutal performance, unique but stunning looks, incredible sound, tons of power from a naturally aspirated, big capacity V12, and it's practical. It's a genuinely usable supercar. Now, of course, practicality doesn't mean much in the game, but I would love to see how this car would compare to many of the other cars in the Gran Turismo franchise, especially as the list of cars in GT Sport continues to be increased with DLC. Most of the cars have been returning faces, but we've had a lot of new ones as well, and this would at the very least make a very interesting rival to the Nissan GTR, but potentially a couple of others too. It's my dream car, which is by far the number one reason why I want it back, but beyond that, it's a good car as well, and something totally different for the Ferrari brand. And imagine using this thing off-road, potentially. That'd be pretty awesome as well. Next up, I'm putting a car which you might not be expecting me to put, given that this was nowhere to be seen in my top 50 favourites. In fact, there were no Porsches whatsoever in my top 50. Even though I do love certain ones, this is the Porsche that I would love to see featured in Gran Turismo the most, with, I would say, the Carrera GT coming in a very, very close second. The reason ultimately why I chose this one, which is of course the Porsche 962 from the Group C era over the Carrera GT, is quite simply because of the usability. The Carrera GT is a fantastic supercar, and it would make a great rival to many of the supercars that are currently in the game. Plus, if they got the sound right, it would be pretty sweet as well. But this one could be an incredible force around the track. In Group 1, for instance, it might end up in Group X. I hope not. If it were to return in Group 1, for instance, it would make a great rival to the modern Le Mans cars. And although ultimately they do have the technical advantage of modern technology, the Porsche is a very dominant machine. It's one of the most dominant Le Mans cars ever built. One of the most dominant Group C cars ever built as well. And also one of the main reasons why I'd love to see this debut on the game is if they ever bring back my personal favourite Le Mans car of all time, the Nissan R92CP, I would love to see how this car would compare to that one. I think they could have a pretty fierce rivalry between, you could argue, the two ultimate longtails. The Porsche, which is the most dominant of them all, and the Nissan, which was the last of them all. So I'd love to see this one debut. It could have incredible top speed. It should have incredible top speed because the real world car does. I mean, just look at the Door 962 Street version, one of the fastest road cars ever built. So, of course, I'd love to see the Porsche 962 feature. Next up on the list, we are once again returning to my favourite cars. This is my 13th favourite car in my top 50, the Haumet TX. I can't believe that it has still taken however long it's been, literally decades at this point, for either Forza or Gran Turismo to have any kind of semblance of a gas turbine powered car. Other games have featured it. I believe, was it Project Cars that has the Lotus Type 56, something like that. And I think people have made a couple of mods for certain games that have turbine cars. Of course, Project Gotham has my favourite bike, the MTT Y2K, but turbines aren't given much love in most games. And that's a shame, because there are plenty of significant ones. The Sochema Gregoire, the Chrysler turbine car, the Jay Leno EcoJet even. Of course, we've had Jay Leno models in the past on Gran Turismo, but this one to me is the obvious choice. Of course, if you're going to add a turbine-powered race car to a game, why wouldn't you add this one? It's the most significant turbine engine car ever built, because it's the only one to ever win a race, thereby proving what they can do. The Haumet TX, I absolutely love it. My favourite race car of all time, even higher than the Nissan R92CP. It's fast. It's not going to take on a Le Mans prototype anytime soon. You're looking at about 170 miles per hour or so, but it's only got 350 horsepower. So, unfortunately, I think this would almost definitely be a Group X car, but I don't even care. I just want the car on the game. This one and the Renault Espace F1 might actually be the two vehicles that I want the most in the franchise. The Espace being my number one returning car, and perhaps this one my number one debut. Because although it's not my favourite car, as I said, it's not actually in my top 10 either, I have so much love for this car and what it represents as far as turbines go, being my favourite engine type of all time. Of course, it has such a special place for me. Next up on the list, I'm going to actually move into the honourable mentions, which I should have really done at the start, but to be honest, I forgot. And that's one of the results of a freestyle series, or a freestyle video. Well, then again, all of my videos are freestyled. So the two honourable mentions in particular, one of which I think has a chance, not a huge chance, but a chance. The other one I think probably will never happen. There's a 99% chance that it will never happen. And that one, to kick off, first of all, is the Mosler MT900. One of my favourite supercars. I would say one of the best supercars ever built. And of course it is featured on Forza, you can see it in the video here. I think it's featured on a couple of other games, in fact it is actually. GTR 400 does actually feature both the Ascari KZ1R and the Mosler MT900, and although I'm not a fan of the game, it is nice to see the Mosler get some love. Of course, a dominant force in racing, kind of legendary for that, for various reasons, some of them not so good, being banned, etc. in different forms. And Mosler is just one of those companies which, like Noble and Ascari and a couple of others, they just quietly made a name for themselves among the discerning buyer as being literally a track weapon for the road. Unfortunately, the main reason why I think it won't come to the game, and pretty much the same reason why I don't think it'll return to Forza either, which is a shame as well, is that they went bankrupt in 2013, which is such a shame. They built less than 200 cars in their entire production run, starting in the 90s, and I don't understand that. How can people not want to own a Mosler? I mean, it's gorgeous, and it's a race winner. That's pretty much the definition of what you want out of a supercar, so it's very strange to me that they folded. Such a shame. I don't think that's going to happen, but it's definitely an honourable mention for me. The other honourable mention, which I think has more of a chance, and I know a lot of people wouldn't care if this one is added, but I actually would really love to see it happen, is the Hennessy Venom, the GT. Now, you might say, well, why not the new one, the Venom F5? It's more powerful, it's faster, and it's not a Lotus, which of course is most people's main gripe about the Hennessy Venom, which, as I've put to rest a number of times on the channel, is not a Lotus. The doors and the roof are from a Lotus, that's it. Everything else is custom. So the fact that it looks like a Lotus Elise GT1 is a good thing, in my book. The fact that it happens to also still be the fastest production car ever from 0 to 200, that's pretty impressive. 14.5 seconds to 200 miles per hour is not too shabby, and even without any tuning, you probably couldn't tune it actually in the game. Then again, you might be able to, actually. That would remain to be seen. N1000 category as standard, of course. It should technically, I guess, be N1200, but of course they don't go that high. But it would be incredible. It should be the fastest street car in the game in a straight line, pretty easily actually. Not off the line, of course, but for mid-range and especially top-end acceleration, nothing else should even come close. The LaFerrari doesn't come close, the Veyron certainly doesn't come close, even the Veyron Supersport doesn't, and neither does the Chiron. So the Venom GT to me is a car that I would just love to see how it would interact in the franchise. How would a car that's so literally overwhelmingly fast react or interact with these other supercars that have been in the franchise before, like the Veyrons and the Enzos and some of the newer, more, you could say, track-focused supercar choices like the LaFerrari. Of course, the Venom wouldn't be great around a track, but it could be a pretty cool professional-level challenge for those of us who love extremely powerful cars. For me personally, of course, the Ultimate Aero is one of my higher place picks. It's my favourite hypercar, in fact. But ultimately, I think I would still rather see the Venom, because the Venom has a bit more of an edge over the Ultimate Aero around corners. So I'd love to see that one feature. Returning back to the primary list, though, which is completely out of order now, the next one is another one of my personal favourites, and like the Howmet, this is one which, as far as I know, hasn't officially been featured in any game. There is footage on YouTube of a mod of this car, and it is the Trossi Monaco T34. My favourite Grand Prix car of all time. It's powered by a radial engine, a 16-cylinder radial engine, which is twin supercharged, putting out, I can't recall the power now, I think it was 250 horsepower, it might have been something like that, but it's a crazy little car, one of the most wacky Grand Prix creations ever, and it's front-wheel drive. So it's got this truly unique layout. It looks like a wing or it looks like a plane, I should say, that's had the wings chopped off. Skinny little tyres like they had back in the 30s. It was actually raced in 1935, and it was deemed to be too dangerous because, among other things, it has one of the most ridiculously front-heavy weight distributions ever. 75% of its weight is over the front end, which made it almost impossible to corner with. And imagine how fun that would be on Gran Turismo. It would be one of those cars that would be next to useless for actually winning anything. Again, probably Group X. There's no way they'd allow this to be in its actual category of around N200 because it would just be too dominant. That wouldn't be fair. So it would almost definitely be a Group X car alongside the Helmet, but I'd just love to see something this crazy. To me, this is the exact kind of car that we started getting into around Gran Turismo 4, when we saw the debut of stuff like the Chaparrals and the Pescarolos, these less obvious choices which actually turned out to be outstandingly good. Plus, of course, you have stuff like the Ford Model T, the Patent Motor Wagons, some of which we discussed again last week, the Ginetta, the Jensen Interceptor. Gran Turismo 4 had a lot of those great quirky little oddball choices which you wouldn't expect to necessarily be in the game. And this is that kind of car, I think. Gran Turismo has always been good for showing these kind of cars a lot of love. But to be honest, this ain't going to happen. I know that, I just had to feature it because it's my favourite Grand Prix car, and it's such a crazy, wacky little machine. Next up on the list, I'm putting a car which is not only one of my favourites, it is in my top 10, but it would most definitely be one of the fastest cars in the game if it were included, because it's one of the fastest cars in real life as well, the Rimac. Now, the obvious choice would be the Concept 2, but as I said in my top 50 countdown, I'm not a fan of that one. And as I said, this is a personal list, so I would go for the Concept 1. 1,090 horsepower, 0 to 60 in, 2.6 seconds, I believe. 2-speed transmission layout where you can launch up to 100 miles per hour, then drop it into second gear and get up to 221, making it, I believe, still the fastest electric car in the world, in a straight line at least. It's an incredible supercar, barely any of them are built, and also, although it is very heavy, primarily due to the battery pack of course, it's actually a very small car. Now of course it would be N1000 class, and imagine the kind of rivalry you could have between the Rimac, the LaFerrari and the Hennessy. If they added the Hennessy as well, it would be kind of like Drive Club, actually, because the Rimac and the Hennessy and also the Koenigsegg 1-to-1 have a fantastic rivalry in that game because they are the three fastest cars in the game in a straight line. But the funny thing is, the Rimac can actually outrun everything else because the Venom and the Koenigsegg have fantastic top-end acceleration, but they cannot even come close to the Rimac off the line because of that launch. It's an incredible hypercar, the definition of an electric hypercar. In fact, I would love to see this one feature. I think there actually is kind of a chance that we could have a car like this in the franchise. I wouldn't put money on it, but I think there is a chance. Next up, I'm going for a car which might not be an obvious choice, but it is one of my favourite Le Mans cars, and one of my favourite cars from Forza 4, for sure. I know a lot of you guys who have played Forza 4 absolutely love this car, for good reason. The Aston Lola. Technically the Aston Martin Lola B09-60 LMP1 machine. One of the last hurrahs of the naturally aspirated petrol non-hybrid Le Mans car. It came out around the time where this kind of Le Mans car was being phased out, really. So in many ways this is, funnily enough, like my favourite Le Mans car. The Nissan R92CP marked the end of a number of eras. It was the last of the Longtails, the last of the, you could say, purpose-built Group Cs that weren't just repurposed from older years, the last of the crazy turbocharged cars, and the most powerful Le Mans car ever built to boot, especially once you don't factor in a hybrid that modern car has. 1,200 horsepower straight from its engine. In a funny kind of way, this Aston is actually similar to that, because it's almost like the end of the pure LMP1 era, before we moved into the hybrid era, which we're currently still in. I think this is possibly the most beautiful LMP car of all, in terms of the modern ones. And of course, technically all Le Mans cars are LMPs, ever since day one, because they're purpose-built for it. But you know what I mean. Modern LMP1s, say from the LMP 900 era in 99 onwards, that's the kind of era that I'm thinking of in particular. It's got one of the most iconic liveries of all time, in Gulf in particular, not the muscle milk version. The sound is incredible, 5.9 litre naturally aspirated V12. It's one of the biggest engines in a modern LMP as well. It's up there with the Panos LMP, which of course I would love to see in the franchise along with the Cadillac. But even though both of those cars are in my top 50, whereas this one isn't, and the Cadillac is my favourite modern LMP, and the Panos is my favourite team, why did I choose the Aston over it? Well, the reason why is because, as much as I love those two, I think that the community as a whole would probably like this Aston more than those two. For me personally, I would choose either of those over this one. But factoring in the entire community, how usable the car is, how incredibly desirable the car is in terms of the performance, the sound, the looks, I think this one would have a better place in the Gran Turismo franchise. Especially since Panos has never had a strong showing. We only had one car. And Cadillac, well, they're not exactly well represented either. You've got the CTS-V and the CN, that's about it. They happen to both be pretty good, especially the CN, but this one I think, especially given the focus that seems to be coming over Aston Martin in Gran Turismo Sport with more race cars, more road cars, DLC being added, it's kind of cool to see Aston Martin finally getting more love in the franchise after just having the same cars in each game over and over again. So I think something like this would fit in really well into the franchise in Group 1. But whether or not it will, I think, is probably doubtable, to say the least. I don't think it will happen, but I really would love to see it happen. And I think that if it were added, it would probably end up being a fan favourite. And anyone who's driven the car on Forza pretty much already will have it as one of their favourites, probably. Next up, I'm putting a car which a ton of people want the manufacturer of, but not so many people want this specific model from the manufacturer, and that is Koenigsegg. Now, Koenigsegg is a manufacturer which, well, everything would point to it being somewhere in my top 50 favourites. It's the exact kind of company that I would love. They are really the definition of an underdog story, arriving at the turn of the century alongside two of its best rivals, Pagani and Spiker. Spiker, of course, being a returning company. And why this one? That's the question. The Koenigsegg CCX, in particular, is the one that I would like to see come to Gran Turismo because, let's be honest, we would be happy if any Koenigsegg arrived at this point because, to some degree, they are all really good. My personal favourite Koenigsegg is the original, the CC8S, because of the purity of its design. But the reason why I picked this one as the one that I would like to see feature in the Gran Turismo franchise first is because, for me at least, and as I said, it is a personal list, this is the pinnacle of Koenigsegg. Now, the pinnacle of something doesn't necessarily mean that it needs to be the most powerful or the fastest. Because to me, if you put all of Koenigsegg's on a timeline, from the original CC prototype right up to the latest Agera RS and the 1-to-1, the Regera, I love those as well. The Regera is one of my favourite Koenigseggs. That would be an awesome car to have. But if you put them all out on a timeline, you can very deliberately look at it as everything was building up to the CCX, and then everything after the CCX feels like a variation of that theme. Now, you might disagree with that, of course, it's a personal opinion, but to me the CCX is to Koenigsegg what the Zonda F is to Pagani. It's that single moment where they didn't end it, they moved on, they made the Cinque, then they made the Huayra, but it was the peak, really. It was the pinnacle of what that brand was about, and it really encapsulated everything that you need to know about the company into one car. The CCX doesn't need to be the fastest Koenigsegg, it's just everything that Koenigsegg is all about. Plus, I love that it was almost at this pivotal time where it almost felt that it didn't need to get faster. Now, of course, Koenigseggs have got faster and faster since then, and this entire argument simply won't make sense to certain people. People who think that being faster and faster every time is a great thing. And of course it is, I'm not saying that it isn't, but there are certain cars which I think don't necessarily need to be refined anymore. They reached exactly what they should be. And to me, the CCX is just that. We didn't need the Trevita, or even the CCXR edition, which I know a ton of people love. That's a great car from Forza Horizon 1. All of them are, objectively speaking, better from a performance point of view. I know that. But to me, the CCX is just... it's the Koenigsegg that I would want to see in the game. It's not my favourite. And yet for these various kind of difficult to explain reasons, it's the one that I would want. That might not make sense. It probably doesn't make sense to a lot of people, but that's just the way it is for me. Not just personally, but more from the community point of view. Next up, though, I'm putting a car which shocks me that it's never been featured on Forza in particular, but also Gran Turismo as well. It seems like such an obvious choice to have on a game, the Mercedes SLR 722 GT. We've had the SLR on a number of games. It's a great supercar, both on Forza and Gran Turismo. We've had some of the variations, like the 722 is on Test Drive Unlimited, the Sterling Moss is on Forza, and Test Drive Unlimited too. But this one, it's literally the ultimate SLR. So how have neither Forza or Gran Turismo ever featured it? Now, some games have. It's featured on Grid 2 and on a couple of other games as well, so it's not completely undershown. But it shocks me that it's not featured on more games. This is literally the Mercedes equivalent to the FXX and the 599XX and the Murcielago RGT and the Maserati MC12 Corsa and the Mazda Furai. It's that level of hardcore track-only supercar from a particular manufacturer. Imagine how cool it would be to take the SLR 722 GT up against not just those obvious ones, but something like the Vulcan. The Aston Martin Vulcan would be a great rival to this car, even though it has way more power, around 800 to this car's 670, but of course you could tune it up. I don't know what category it would be in. That would be kind of a weird one. My thoughts would initially go to Group X, but at the same time, the Vulcan is an N-Class car. So that would be interesting, because of course technically this falls into a bit of a no man's land, like the FXX, where it kind of is a race car, but it isn't a race car at the same time. It's more like a club sport racer for private owners, again, like the FXX and a number of others. So it's in a bit of a weird territory, but I would love to see this one feature. I think it would be a really fun car to drive, certainly a very fast one, and it's just probably my wild card pick, I think. This is the car that I think probably no one would have expected me to pick, but I think it's such a cool choice. How has Forza never had this car? It's so weird to me that they haven't. It's the exact kind of car that they would have. But for whatever reasons, they haven't. And finishing off last, you've always got to finish a countdown with a disappointing car. But it's not disappointing for me, because I want not just this car, but I want this brand to feature on Gran Turismo, because, once again, never featured on Forza, never featured on Gran Turismo, barely featured on any games at all for that matter, Skoda. Now, a lot of people will immediately turn off when they see that name, but hear me out. Skoda is one of my favourite brands, as weird as it is to say that, and this is literally my favourite WRC car ever. The Skoda Fabia WRC, in particular the earlier generation, around 2004-2005. There are a couple of different evolutions of the car, they look very similar. It's on the WRC games in particular, and it was my go-to vehicle, along with the Hyundai Accent, which is another one of my favourites. But to me, the Skoda, it's almost like the spiritual successor in some ways to the Daihatsu Storia Cross 4, which is one of my favourite hatchbacks, and of course is in the Gran Turismo franchise. Great little sleeper car. And it's very similar. If you look at the two cars, they're very similar looking. The proportions where they are wide, not very long, it gives them great counterbalance through tight technical corners. We don't have enough rally cars in the game as it is, and there's no chance that this one's going to come into the game, of course not. But I'd love to see it happen. As I said, very personal list. Skoda needs to come to Gran Turismo as far as I'm concerned. I even built a livery for it on the BMW M6 race car. I would love this car, put simply, to be in the game, and for those who haven't driven any games with this car on them, I guarantee you'll love it. It's such a good rally car to work with. The proportions are excellent. It's even more compact than something like a Focus rally car. It's just great. I love it. Very personal picks though, of course, that's the whole point of the list. So slap down below what cars you would like to see. Maybe if you could keep it to 10, maybe go up to 15 if you have to. I think most people probably will now I've said that. Maybe with a couple of honourable mentions. But of course don't go overboard, because we could all make it a 100 list if we wanted to. So that's it for this countdown. If you haven't checked out last week's video for the 10 returning cars to the franchise, then I'd urge you to check that one out as well. And of course, I'll see you guys next time. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.